I'd like to get started, everybody. My name is TJ Pempel. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and I appreciate everyone's coming out here after a long day and a productive day yesterday and a long morning as well, and from what I can gather, a long evening for many of our participants last night. Let me introduce our panelists, and I'll do this very briefly because you should have the full biographies of all of them in your booklets. To my immediate left is Professor Okonogi Masao. He is Professor Emeritus from Keio University. Next to him, Professor Jo Dong-ho, who is from Eva University, who specializes in North Korean studies. Still further to the left, John Delury at Yonsei University, who is in the Graduate School of International Studies and whose specialty is primarily Chinese studies. Then John Swenson-Wright, who comes to us from Cambridge, England, where he specializes in modern Japanese studies, and he also does a great deal of work on international relations of East Asia. And both of the two Johns are involved in global Asia in various editorial capacities. And then finally, to the far left, Professor Jin Jingyi from Beijing University, and he is a specialist on China-Korean relations. The topic that we're going to address today is essentially the succession issue in North Korea and the question of the prospects that might exist for economic reform and for political reform within the North Korean regime. So I've asked each of our panelists to limit their remarks to 5 minutes with a 2-minute cushion max, and we will do all sorts of things to try to keep to the time limit, because the chair has a plane to catch, and I have every interest in making my plane, so I will do my best to enforce the time. So let me start with Professor Okonogi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But I'd like to speak in Korean, so please use your phone from those from outside. 이 세션 파워 석세션 권력 승계하고 경제적인 개방 개혁 이야기인데 나는 그 스피커로서 그리 적당하지 않을지도 모르겠습니다. 왜냐하면 그 권력 승계는 비교적 순조롭게 되어 있다고 그렇게 보고 있기 때문에 문제 제기를 하지 못한다는 뜻입니다. 내가 보기에는 가장 어려웠던 시기가 역시 2008년 여름부터 가을 그 김정일이 무너졌을 때, 그때가 가장 어려웠을 때였고, 지금은 제3남 김정은의 후계자로서 나와 있고, 그래서 지금 남아있는 그 문제는 그 사람의 개인적인 능력 문제, 사실 그 사람이 지도자로 될 수 있는 그런 능력을 가지고 있는가 없는가, 특히 독재자로서의 능력이 어떻게 무자비하게 단호하게 정치를 할 수 있는가, 그런 능력 문제라고 생각합니다. 아마 김정일이 이 장남으로 비해서 3남 김정은 지정한 것이 그 사람이 그런 능력을 가지고 있다고 보기 때문이 아닌가, 그렇게 봅니다. 사실은 저는 오전쪽에 전체 회의에서도 이야기했는데, 지금 북한에서는 여러 가지 문제가 진행되고 있습니다만, 모든 문제가 결합되어서 연결되어서 진행되고 있는 것 같습니다. 예를 들면 지금 지난주에 김정일은 중국 방문해서 후진타오 만나서 여러 가지 회담하고 돌아왔는데, 사실 그 사람이 6.km를 일주일 동안 여행할 수 있는 등간을 가지고 있다는 거, 그리고 중국의 강한 그 지원을 받고 있다는 것을 증명했습니다. 그런데 그건 중국과 북한 관계뿐 아니라 승계 문제에서도 영향을 줄 것이고 대미 관계, 대남 관계에서도 영향을 주는 것이고 그래서 모든 문제가 한꺼번에 김정일 머릿속에서 여러 가지 운영되고 있는 것 그렇게 볼 수가 있습니다. 개인 권력 승계에 대해서는 사실은 그 북한에서는 완조적인 방식으로 그러니까 김정일을 지명하는 식으로서 후계자가 결정되는 것이기 때문에 문제 없다 그렇게 볼 수는 있습니다만 그러나 역시 너무 젊었다는 것이 문제이죠. 그래서 작년 9월에는 탄 대표자회를 열리고 탄 조직을 정상화해서 그 사람으로 박합하는 그런 모양으로 보이고 있습니다. 30년 만에 그런 단대회를 열린다. 내 기억하기에는 80년에 6차 대회 이후 그런 큰 대회는 처음이니까 30년 만에 그런 대회를 하고 개최하고 그리고 그 사람으로 당 군사위원회 부위원장으로 지명했다는 것이 역시 중요한 일이었다. 그렇게 할 수가 있습니다. 그리고 그러나 그 승계는 아직까지 끝나지 못하고 김정일이 건강 유지하는 이상 그 사람이 지금 모든 것을 하고 있다고 나는 보고 있습니다. 될 수 있는 대로 후계자를 위해서 마무리해서 조건으로 만들고 있는 것이기 때문에 이제부터 김정은 군사위원회 위원장은 인민군 최고사령관도 되어야 하고 국방위원회에서도 지명한 자리를 얻어야 하고 그런 것이 하나씩 성사되고 나중에 완전히 김정일이 지고 난 후에 후계자로서 다음 지도자로서 등장한다. 그렇게 보고 있습니다. 개혁 개방 이야기는 여러 가지가 있습니다만 2 minutes. 오케이. 중국과의 관계에 있어서 그것을 추진하려고 하고 있는 것 같습니다. 즉 개혁 개방을 하되 주로 지금은 중국을 대상해서 중국이 일행하는 식으로 그것을 추진하려고 하고 있는 것 그렇게 보입니다. 그러니까 남한에 대해서 그런 식으로 개방하는 것도 아니고 근데 어떤 식으로 하고 있는가에 대해서는 뭐 마지막에 계시는 김경일 교수가 그 전문가이기 때문에 나중에 그 이야기를 해줄 것이라 그렇게 믿겠습니다. 감사합니다. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Professor Bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to talk about current North Korean economic condition. It is not because I am an economist, but because evaluation of current North Korean economic condition is very closely related with the theme of this session, opening and reform of DPRK in the future. Many people think that North Korean economic condition is very bad now. However, I don't believe that. If I say my conclusion first, I believe North Korean economic condition is getting better recently. In South Korea, everybody has an incentive to exaggerate the real situation of the North Korean economy. For instance, South Korean government or conservatives or the ruling party of South Korea saying that because of principled North Korean policy by Lee Myung-bak is very effective, so that's why North Korean economy is bad. So we have to maintain current policy direction in order to make North Korea, let's say, apologize or say sorry. On the other hand, opposition party or NGOs saying that because of these hardline policies, North Korean economy is bad and people are starving, so it is better to change the current policy directions. Well, then why do I believe North Korean economy is going good? There are two reasons. One is thanks to market. Since 2003, markets were allowed in North Korea. So now people, and since then, market has been expanding in terms of numbers and in terms of also sizes. So in the old days, let's say in the middle of 1990s when there was so-called Adios March, if people don't get food from the government, people had no choice but to starve. However, these days, people has an alternative, saying that, going to the market. So people can do business in the market, whereas those who are not able to join the market inside, then they can do, there are kind of porters or barbers or people who are making and selling noodles outside the market. So there are very many chances for market activities. So that's why people are getting better. And so, for instance, in the old days, if North Korean government produces and distributes $100 of wheat, then people just ate. But now, if people have $100 of wheat, then they don't eat. Rather, they make noodles and sell in the market at $100 and $20. So there are $20 of value added, and that's certainly contributing to the positive growth of the North Korean economy. And second point is that there are huge increase in DPRK-China economic cooperation. For instance, last year, DPRK-China trade volume was record high. It increased by almost 30% compared to the previous year. And especially North Korean export to China increased by 50%. And major import items from China are all production goods. Last year, number one import item was energy. Number two is machinery. Number three is electric products. All these are production goods, and it has positive effect on the positive growth of the North Korean economy. So, because of these two reasons, I believe North Korean economy has been getting better in recent years. Do I have 1 or 2 more minutes? Okay. However, there are side effects, of course. Concerning the market expansion, one side effect is that there are gaps in terms of income or living condition among the regions or people, classes. So, in North Korea now, there are some group of people who are getting much better than before. However, there are some people who are getting much worse than before. So, depending on which side you look at, you can tell, oh, North Korean economy is getting better or worse. So both are right. And number two side effect is that, which is much more serious to the North Korean leadership, is that expansion of markets implies shrinking of planned official sector. So North Korea has declared that they are going to build so-called Gangsong-daegu, strong and prosperous country next year. But that Gangsong-daegu is not any Gangsong-daegu, but socialist Gangsong-daegu. So North Korea has to maintain socialist system regime. But market expansion is very troublesome or risky to maintaining the regime. However, North Korea has no choice but to approve or condone the market activities. So that is the dilemma of North Korean leadership today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Delury.
Okay, thank you. To stick with the 5 minutes, I'll try to make 3 points. One, a general conceptual point about the sequencing of economic change and the security situation. And then secondly, where I think the DPRK is in terms of their economic policy. And then thirdly, what I think the implications are for how to best respond to the situation as it is. So I'm going to also focus on the prospects for reform and opening part of the two questions we were given, but happy to discuss succession in the time afterward. So the first overall conceptual point, and this is something that was for me one of the main lessons learned from a 2-year and I suppose ongoing project by a small unofficial initiative by a small group of Americans that I've been a part of to make a case for economic engagement from the American side with North Korea and propose some very modest measures for how to do that. So we started that work in early 2009 when I was at the U.S.-China Center at Asia Society and published a task force report making that case. But one of the main lessons for me, and during these 2 years I've had somewhat regular contact, direct contact with North Korean diplomats in different parts of the world, and also regular dialogue, especially with Chinese, because that's my background is China, so trying to understand the Chinese perspective on North Korea. For me, the biggest lesson learned has been that security precedes development, that the security situation will have to improve significantly from the North Korean perspective. Their perception of their security environment will have to improve significantly before there will be a real serious and systematic push at reform and opening, and particularly at economic reform. And I'm probably biased by my background coming from China, where that's my understanding of what's happened in China, is that it was really under Mao, even in the worst years of Mao, that China achieved a level of security, primarily through the new relationship with the United States, and that the major economic direction of reform and opening under Deng Xiaoping came next in the late 70s and early 1980s. And I think the reason for that makes sense from a North Korean perspective, is that if and when they embark on these kind of economic reforms, it's going to be highly destabilizing, as China experienced, most particularly in the 1980s, in the late 80s. And so they're extremely cautious about doing it. In a strange way, as bad as the current situation is, they know what it is, and they think they can survive through it. And so they're quite tentative about embarking on serious reform. So I don't think it's going to happen until they feel much more secure about their prospects to survive and persist as a state and as a regime. In terms of second point, where North Korea is now on its economy and economic policy making, working off of Professor Zhou's description, my sense in talking with North Korean economic officials is that they're in a sort of gray zone in between a centralized, somewhat autarkic, planned economy, which did function at least for some long period of time in North Korea, but ceased functioning a while ago. They're somewhere in between that and a open, market-based economy, commercial economy. So they're in this gray zone, and occasionally they make efforts to, put the genie back in the bottle, and that doesn't work. And occasionally they make efforts, but very tentative ones, toward what looks like some kind of economic reform, and that doesn't really happen. So that's my sense of where they are and where they'll be, perhaps for a while. So the third point, policy implications or response implications of that are that I think the priority in the near term, short term, should be a very different policy than South Korea and the United States are approaching. That South Korea and the United States and others should follow China in encouraging as much economic engagement as possible, including, by economic engagement, I mean not only business deals and trades and joint ventures, but almost more importantly, exchanges, human capacity building or knowledge training. There's a lot of technical terms for it. But getting North Koreans out to learn more about economic management and policy making, and sending more people into North Korea to learn about where they are, to talk with them about the economic issues that they face. To me, that would be a wiser approach, and it could still make room for smart sanctions, but narrowly focused sanctions on weapons of mass destruction, on nuclear counterproliferation, and military to some broader extent, but basically focus those sanctions as narrowly as possible on those issues, and otherwise encourage engagement as much as is possible. And I think the main reason for that is if and when the North Koreans come to this point where they're ready to embark, especially on reform, they're going to need a critical mass of expertise, of people within their system who can advise political leadership that give them the green light or yellow light to figure out how to actually manage this and make these economic decisions and policy decisions. And that's, again, a lesson from China, is that's incredibly difficult to do. So it's in the other countries' interest to help North Korea create that capacity within their current elite. As hard as that is to stomach in many political circles, I think that's the best course of action.
Thank you very much. Professor Svensson-Wright.
Thanks very much. As a historian, I'm naturally wary about making predictions, but let me try and set out a few things which I think are worth thinking about, both in terms of the succession, but also the broader question of where economic reform is headed. I think the evidence suggests that Kim Jong-un is clearly being prepared as the natural successor to his father. We've seen last year his appointment as a four-star general, his appointment as a vice minister to the important Central Military Commission. We've also seen a growing presence visibly on the ground with Kim Jong-un accompanying his father on trips around the country, and most recently, of course, on his trip to China. There have also been reports that January the 1st will now be designated his birthday as a public holiday. And also in January of this year, the North Korean media carried a one-hour documentary on the life of Kim Jong-un. So clearly there's a lot of effort to try and introduce him to the North Korean people. But as previous speakers have mentioned, of course, there are limits to his ability to lead from the front, given his age, his lack of experience. He certainly hasn't had the 18 years that his father had to, as it were, grow into the role as leader of North Korea. And so I think the immediate prospect for who will lead North Korea on the death of Kim Jong-il is that we will see some sort of regency with Kim Jong-hwe, Kim Jong-il's sister, and her husband, Chang Song-taek, probably taking on that role as regents. Looking beyond the personal issues and thinking in terms of the institutional balance of power in North Korea, what's, I think, important to stress in this context is that we've moved in the last 20 years away from the very monolithic model of politics associated with Kim Il-sung to a more pluralistic system in which three key institutions, the army, the party and the state structures, have in a sense been competing and vying for influence. The army with its commitment to a strong military, and as part of that, a strong commitment to maintaining North Korea's nuclear capability. The state as the guardians of the ideological flame, the notion of juche and self-reliance. And the government, and particularly in this context, the foreign ministry, the party perhaps most representative of a pro-engagement, pragmatic approach to dealing with the outside world. Since late 2009, I think the balance has shifted in favour of those more hardline forces within the army and the state institutions. And some reflection of that has been the expansion of the National Defence Commission to incorporate a larger number of state officials. And some have gone further and suggested that the events of last year, the sinking of the Cheonan and Yeonpyeong, bear all the hallmarks, all the fingerprints of those hardliners attempting to assert their authority. But if we step back from actions and look at language and rhetoric, then I think the situation is a little less clear-cut. In this year's joint New Year's editorial, we saw in a commitment to meetings at any time and at any place with anyone, a signal from the regime that they want to engage. And at the same time, the army, true to its traditional hardline posture, is talking of traitors in the south and clearly seeking to attack the government of Lee Myung-bak. The factor that I think is going to encourage the forces of moderation, at least in the medium term, to win out, is the economic conditions of the country. And in this context, I think I have a slightly different position from Professor Zhu. Yes, it's true that there has been a great deal of, in a sense, practical change at the ground level in terms of marketization. But rather than seeing this as an active attempt by the state to introduce change, it perhaps might be more useful to think of this as a process of bottom-up reform. Reform driven by economic necessity. And this grey economy in which individuals, simply by virtue of economic necessity, are struggling to, in a sense, challenge indirectly the power of the state for economic reasons, whether it's through taking second jobs, or in a sense with the covert connivance of their employers in the state structures to moonlight or to seek new economic opportunities. All of these changes, I think, represent a fragmentation of the state. And create a context in which new stresses and strains are emerging. We've seen the outbreak of more cases of corruption, of undesirable social activity, whether it's prostitution or gambling. And in response to that, the state has been seeking to reassert its authority by emphasizing, for example, the importance of more indoctrination of state and party officials. And this represents, I think, a movement backwards. In terms of solutions and thinking what the international community can provide as a response to these changes on the ground level, in terms of the immediate nuclear challenge, China's approach and its emphasis on a three-stage phased approach for negotiation, prioritizing re-establishment of dialogue between North and South Korea, leading in turn to closer dialogue between Washington and Pyongyang, and ultimately the restart of the six-party talks process, represents a viable first step. But the limits in this case are associated with certain key ambiguities, not least the ambiguity over denuclearization and how to define it. Because the North's perception is that denuclearization is a much more comprehensive approach than simple denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but an approach which would effectively mean the United States giving up on extended deterrence and abandoning its alliance relationships with South Korea and Japan. And clearly that's not a practical step forward. The North, for its part, I think, for rational, self-interested reasons, sees its nuclear capability as its most important insurance policy, and therefore is not about to give up on this initiative. So where are we left? I think probably the area where I would like to stress as a European is, in a sense, to echo the remarks of the previous speaker, which is to say that we can think in terms of educational engagement, cultural contacts, and the role of NGOs in facilitating positive dialogue. In this context, I think the European experience is important because Europe has established a residential, as it were, presence in North Korea, whether it's through humanitarian assistance or last year, for example, the establishment of the Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. These are creating real frameworks for trust and collaboration. And without wishing to sound overly optimistic, because I think there are limits to how far this process can go, they provide us, I think, with an important blueprint or a roadmap for conceptualizing how best to promote dialogue with the North. It is effectively an incremental approach. But why that incremental approach is important is, I think, really explained by the precarious nature of the relationship that we saw last year. We shouldn't forget that one of the key hallmarks of the North Korean government's approach to its relations with its neighbours is its willingness to intentionally provoke, to secure the attention of the international community. Out of that comes a situation, particularly with the North-South relationship as precarious as it is at present, of the risk of conflict through miscalculation. And dialogue and discussion and this type of engagement is a necessary means of, I think, reducing the risk of conflict through miscalculation and encouraging trust and wider cooperation. But I think that's my time.
Thank you very much. And finally, Professor Jin.
I'm sorry I can't speak English. I speak Korean. 그 후계자 그 문제 한에서는요, 제가 보건대는 그러니까 북한의 그 후계자 문제 한에서 제가 좀 부정적인 그 견해를 많이 가질 때 있습니다. 후계자 그런 게 있을 수 없다고 저는 생각했대는데요. 결국에는 뭐 소설 같은 그 이야기가 현실로 됐고요. 그래서 왜서 그 북한에서 이 후계자 구축을 그렇게 서두르는가 보게 되면 제일 중요한 원인은 하나 그 김정일이 그 건강 문제라고 봅니다. 그래서 김정일이 건강이 악화되면 악화될수록 그 후계자 문제가 굉장히 그 다그치는 그런 느낌이 있고요. 그래서 이것은 이 김정일이 건강하고 관계되는 것, 그리고 북한에서 후계자를 그 김정일 3남으로서 결정할 수밖에 없는 그런 상황이 아닌가 저는 생각합니다. 그 체제상의 특성상에. 그래서 그 김정일이 무슨 급변 사태가 있다 할 때 그 권력을 자기 자식이 아니고 친척이 아닌 다른 사람한테다 넘겨줘서 작은 정권이 현 체제를 유지할 수 있겠나 이런 측면에서 볼 때는 여전히 이 정권 유지 이런 측면에서 이런 선택을 할 수밖에 없지 않았는가 생각합니다. 그래서 그게 좋고 나쁘고를 떠나서 이 권력 체제 구축이 그 한반도의 이 북한의 그 정권 유지와 안정, 그리고 더 나아가서 경제 회복 발전에 유리한가 불리한가 놓고 볼 때는 좀 더 우리가 다르게 좀 생각해봐야 되지 않겠나, 그런 측면에서 제가 느끼건대 후계자 구축은 이때까지 보게 되면 1단계는 순리롭게 통과됐고 지금 2단계에 진입하지 않는가 생각해서 총체적으로는 순리롭게 진행되는 과정이다, 저는 그렇게 봅니다. 그리고 김정은이 후계자 체제 구축을 원만하게 이행하려게 되면 제일 중요한 거는 경제라고 봅니다, 저는. 그러니까 지금 북한은 이제 방금 조홍호 교수님도 말씀하셨지만 저도 거기 동감이고요. 경제는 분명 좋아지는 면이 있습니다. 그런데 중국의 계획개방 특성 놓고 보면 경제가 조금 좋아지게 되면 다른 문제가 많이 생기는 그런 특성이 있거든요. 그래서 역시 지금 어떤 분들이 지금 그러니까 한국의 주요 매체들도 그런 얘기를 많이 하는데 북한에서 정부에 대해 무슨 이렇게 비난하고 욕하고 이런 걸 많이 얘기하는데 저는 다른 한 측면에서 경제가 좀 좋아지면서 뭔가 조금 여유가 있어서 그런 것도 생기지 않나, 그런 측면으로도 좀 보고 싶고요. 그래서 총체적으로 저도 북한을 갔다 오면서 느낀 게 그전보다는 많이 풀어졌다는 걸, 그런 걸 느낄 수 있었습니다. 그리고 사실상 경제뿐만 아니라 사람들이 말하는 태도 여러 가지를 볼 때 그전보다 확실히 큰 변화가 있다는 걸 느꼈습니다. 그래서 이번에 김정일이 방중하면서 우리가 모두 기대했던 거는 획기적인 혹은 깜짝 쇼라든가 획기적인 이런 걸 가져오지 않았는가 자꾸 얘기를 하는데, 근데 사실 저는 그것보다 더 중요한 게 북한은 지금 변화하고 있다. 근데 그 변화는 획기적인 큰 변화는 아니지만 실질적인 변화가 있다, 저는 그렇게 보는 겁니다. 그러면 북한은 사실 계획 개방 의지가 있냐 없냐 이게 그냥 도마에 오르고 하는데요. 저는 80년대 중국이 금방 계획 개방했을 때 북한이 중국을 따라서 계획 개방 길을 들어섰다고 봅니다. 그래서 그때 나진 선봉이라든가 특구라든가 혹은 외자 도입이라든가 이러한 것에서 북한도 뭔가 발걸음을 내디뎠는데 거기에 대해서 결정적 타격을 준 게 중국의 천안문 사태하고 루마니아 사태, 동구 사건, 러시아 구소련 붕괴, 이 사태가 북한의 계획 개방 의지를 결정적으로 좌절시켰다고 봅니다. 그래서 북한이 이때까지 추구한 거는 한 걸음 한 걸음 이런 계획 개방이 아니고 결국에는 이 도약식 발전, 그러면 핵을 가지고 뭔가 큰 걸 얻어내려 하고요. 그리고 북한 경제 특성상 제가 한번 북경대학 대표단으로 김성종합대학 갔을 때 그분들이 우리하고 얘기하는 게 IT, 나노기술, 생명과학 분야에서 협력할 수 없는가요? 그래서 그런 얘기를 할 때는 최첨단 기술이죠. 최첨단 기술을 그래서 왜 해서 그걸 강조하게 되냐면 그런 기술을 발전시키게 되면 계획개방이라든가 농촌계획이라든가 이런 걸 거치지 않고 도약식 발전할 수 있다. 그렇게 생각하는 것 같습니다. 그래서 저는 핵도 그렇고 경제 이 모든 면에서 계획개방을 포기하고 그렇지만 경제는 발전시켜야 하는데 발전시키는 루트가 역시 이렇게 도약식 핵을 가지고 뭔가 큰 걸 얻어내려고 그런 게 아닌가. 이때까지는 그렇게 추구하지 않았는가 그렇게 생각하고요. 그런데 최근에 전 느낌은 이제는 작지만 실질적인 변화가 일어나고 있다. 그걸 느꼈습니다. 그리고 특히 중국하고 북한 이 경제 교류라든가 무역 관계라든가 이런 걸 볼 때는 아주 작지만 실질적인 교류가 시작됐고요. 그러면 왜 해서 지금 중국하고 북한이 이렇게 그 교류가 어느 때보다도 활발하게 진행될 수 있냐 하게 되면 양국의 국가 이익이 지금 합치됐다고 봅니다. 중국은 지금 그 동북진흥이라는 그 국가적 과제를 완수해야 되는데 북한이 문을 열어 안 주게 되면 사실 그것도 그 헛수고죠. 그래서 중국이 이 동북진흥이라는 이 큰 프로젝트를 수행할 때 꼭 북한은 문을 열게 해야 된다. 이게 하나 있고, 그리고 또 북한도 현재 상황에서는 이제는 뭐 한국의 그 대북 정책이라든가 미국이라든가 일본의 그 압력이라든가 제재에 그래서 사실 기댈 곳이 중국밖에 없다고 봅니다. 그래서 그런 상황에서 북한도 그 전에는 중국에서 그게 되면 수혜를 하는 형식으로 수혜를 받는 형식으로 북한 지원 중국의 지원을 받고 했지만 이제는 그쪽이 아니고 북한도 주동적으로 자기 그 조혈 능력에 그러면 피를 만들 수 있는 능력을 키워가는 쪽으로 가닥을 잡은 게 아닌가 저는 그렇게 봅니다. 그래서 현 시점에서 물론 그 뭐야 한국의 현재 대북 정책이라든가 일부 그 한국 일각에서는 북한의 뭐야 붕괴되는 쪽으로도 얘기 많고요. 또 그걸 또 기대하는 분들도 많고 한데 현 시점이야말로 북한의 이러한 그 변화를 포착해서 북한이 정말 시장경제 요소를 받아들이게 함으로써 그 경제를 가지고 모든 문제를 해결할 수 있는 그런 계기를 만드는 게 현명한 방법이 아닌가 저는 그렇게 생각합니다. 그래서 북한이 경제가 회복되고 발전되게 되면 그에 따라서 많은 문제들이 해결된다고 봅니다. 주의력이 경제가 하게 되면 왜 그런가 하면 이 경제를 발전시키자면 우선 시스템부터 바꿔야 되고 하니까요. 그래서 저는 뭐 북핵 문제 같은 것도 사실은 이 경제하고 관련되는 거라고 봅니다. 그래서 이런 면에서 우리 그 한국도 그렇고 중국도 그렇고 이 동북아시아에서 좀 협력해서 북한을 이 시점에 북한을 계획 개방하도록 유도하는 게 이런 쪽에서 협력하는 게 아주 현명한 방법이 아닌가 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for being as tight with their time as I had asked them to be, and I deeply appreciate that. I want to raise several questions, and basically the kinds of questions that I want to raise fall into three categories. One is about the succession issue. One is about the question of possible economic reform and political reform. And then the third batch of questions really deal with the issue of what, if any, steps should be taken by the surrounding neighbors of the North Korean regime to encourage the various changes. But let me start with the question of the regime transformation, the regime succession. And Professor Okonogi very explicitly said that you think the regime, the transition has been made. And yet Professor Jin suggested that this was a very hasty regime, and Professor Svensson-Wright suggested that, in fact, there are now many more pluralistic actors in the North. And so I guess I would like to ask Professor Okonogi to begin by commenting on whether he thinks that even though the heir has been designated, whether this will be a smooth power transition or whether there is likely to be internal dispute among the political leadership and among the various sectors within the country.
네, 흑의 작업이 완성했다. 그런 뜻으로 한 것이 아니라 단계적으로 순조롭게 되어 있다. 그렇게 말씀 들었습니다. 네, 지금 단계 첫 번째 단계는 김정일 군간 나빠졌을 때 어떻게 그 이머전시 대처하는가, 그게 가장 큰 문제였기 때문에. 그런데 2년 전, 3년 전에 그게 없었습니다. 그래서 그 사람들이 서툴러서 그런 경우는 후계자가 김정은이라는 것을 단계적으로 존리해왔다. 그렇게 보고 있습니다. 그러나 그러면은 나중에 김정일은 언제, 그 타이밍이 어렵죠. 언제 돌아가시고 그게 내년인지 5년 후인지 10년 후인지 그게 우리는 알 수가 없습니까? 그래서 그 사람이 오래 가면 갈수록 그 준비는 잘못되는 것이죠. 근데 그 전에 살아있는 동안에 후계가 끝난다는 것은 그러고 있을 수 없는 이야기입니다. 김일성부터 김정일도 그랬습니다. 그래서 위험한 게 있다면은 김정일이 일찍 돌아가시고 사망하고 젊은 김정은이 권력을 승계해서 모든 일을 해야 하는 그 입지에 그게 일찍 그런 시기가 일찍 오면은 그야 좀 어렵죠. 자기 체제를 만들 때까지 아무래도 5년, 10년 걸리기 때문에 그동안은 가도기라고 할 수도 있고 그 가도기는 흑영하는 사람도 도와줄 사람도 있어야 하고 중국도 도와줘야 하고 그런 거 있을 수가 있는 이야기 아닙니까? 그런데 김정은 밖에 선택지는 없는 것이기 때문에 쉽게 권력 투쟁이 일어나서 뭐 한다 그런 게 너무 쉽게 생각하지 않는 게 낫다고 나는 그렇게 봅니다.
Thank you very much. I wonder if Professor Jin has the same or shares the same view on this, or whether you have a somewhat different view as to the probability of political tensions in terms of the transformation of regimes or leadership.
예, 저는 기본상 오코노미스 교수님 견해에 동의하고요. 하나에 따게 되면 권력 승계가 순리롭게 되냐 안 되냐의 관건은 김정일 건강이라고 봅니다. 그래서 김정일이 건강이 호전되고 혹은 계속 자기 유지할 수 있을 상황에서는 김정일은 북한에서 절대 1인자입니다. 그러니까 절대 1인자 밑에서는 권력 투쟁이라든가 당정군의 무슨 서로 이러한 투쟁들이 있을 수 없다고 봅니다. 그거는 일치하게 나갈 수밖에 없는 상황이고, 그래서 제일 관건은 김정일의 건강에 따라서 뭔가 좌우되는 거 아닌가 하고요. 그리고 만약 지금 상황에서 우리가 예측할 수 없지만 정말 급변 사태가 났다 할 때는 어떻게 과연 전개되냐 할 때는 사실 제 느낌은 그거는 좀 예측 불가능한 상태가 아닌가 생각합니다. 그래서 역시 김정일의 건강에 굉장히 관계가 많다고 봅니다.
Thanks. And let me finally ask John Swenson Wright if you have any similar or different thoughts that you'd like to share.
4 quick points, I think, on this question. If the picture that I presented of a regency of sorts takes place when Kim Jong-il dies, one of the really important questions is how much influence Chiang Song-taek is going to have. And he's reputed not to have very strong links with the military. And if the military, partly because of the obvious external security pressures, feels that its interests are being underrepresented, then that raises very important questions about the ability to maintain control. Secondly, I think, is a very important question of legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary North Koreans. How do you persuade the North Korean public? Because I think an element of persuasion will be needed that Kim Jong-un is, in fact, the rightful and natural successor to Kim Jong-il. I mean, this will only be the second time we've had a hereditary succession in North Korea, for obvious reasons. And I think that, therefore, poses a challenge in terms of how he's sold and presented to the wider leadership. The third question, I think, that's going to be really important in terms of stability is how he performs. Because it really is, I think, very much a blank slate on which we're trying to project some sort of sense of who this person is. That's not unprecedented. If one thinks back to 1994, when Kim Jong-il was introduced to the international community and to his own people, we were in a similar type of situation of a lot of ambiguity about what style, what sort of leader he was going to be. So the same situation pertains. And in that context, I think the international community itself will also be part of that wider pluralistic community of actors who have an influence on how the leadership performs. Because a new leader is also a new opportunity for fresh political initiatives. Some might argue that with the transition of power, the West, or the United States in particular, could use this opportunity to make a new, fresh, quite ambitious diplomatic overture And that would in turn, of course, have a real impact in terms of the ability of this man to lead his own people.
Thank you very much. Professor Zhou made the interesting point that everybody outside of the North has an incentive to indicate or suggest that the economy is in dreadful shape for political reasons, and his own view was that the economy is not in such bad shape. And I believe Professor Jin shared that view, but both of the two of you both suggested that one of the real keys to the economic success, quote unquote, in in North Korea, is the close relationship with China. And I wonder if either of you have the view that there's also a downside to that to the extent that the North becomes extremely dependent on Chinese foreign direct investment and or Chinese assistance and Chinese breaking of sanctions, whether there's such a growing dependency that the North risks losing the real moves to openness and really becomes an economic subsidiary of China. Maybe I could ask this first of Professor Zhou and then Professor Jin.
Well, I am rather optimistic about the future of North Korea and North Korean economy and Kim Jong-un's regime, because, well, next year North Korea will and has to declare they achieve Kangsong-daegu, so-called, strong and prosperous country, whatever happens. So it seems to me that the Kim Jong-il era is going to end essentially if North Korea declares they achieve Kangsong-daegu. That means Kim Jong-un's regime will start next year, where new leader in a new era will need a new slogan. Now in North Korea, Sungun, military first politics is North Korea's national slogan. However, it is nothing but survival logic. When North Korea, Sungun slogan appeared in 1998, when North Korea faced very extremely difficult situation internally and externally. Cold War was over. Soviet Union collapsed. China approached to South Korea. Kim Il-sung died all of a sudden. Arduous march started. Hundreds of thousands of people starved to death. So, top priority agenda at that time was to survive. What about no matter how much the cost is. So that's why North Korea introduced Sungun politics, military first politics to survive first. However, whole environment has changed today. As I said earlier, economic condition is getting better. China became G2 and fully supports North Korea, and so on and so forth. And now, and furthermore, North Korea already declared, Kangsong-daegu next year. So Kim Jong-un should need some kind of slogan, not survival anymore, but something related with growth or development. So then, if Kim Jong-un adopts growth slogan, then how it should be done by open door policy. And so DPRK-China economic relationship will expand in the near future, and DPRK's dependence on Chinese will be greater.
Thank you. Professor Jin, thoughts on the links to China and economic reform?
지금 중국하고 북한의 그걸 방금 말씀하셨는데요. 사실 중국은 지금 시장경제 체제고 북한은 아직까지 지금 계획경제 체제이기 때문에 사실 겨울이라든가 여러 면에서 투자라든가 밸런스가 잘 맞지 않는다고 생각합니다. 그러면 중국이 들어가서 하는 것이 옛날에 식민지처럼 약탈이 아니고 역시 윈윈으로 해서 북한도 이익을 보고 중국도 이익을 보는 그런 상호 관계가 아닌가 생각합니다. 그럼 이 과정에서 저는 변화하는 게 북한이라고 봅니다. 북한이 계속 계획 경제를 해서 꽉 막힌 그런 정책 쓰게 되면 중국에서도 이 시장 경제 체제가 들어가서 설 자리가 없거든요. 그러면 북한 시스템, 북한 체제도 바뀌어야 된다고 봅니다. 그러면 앞으로 이렇게 그 서로 그 교류를 강화하면서 북한이 물론 초기에는 중국에 의존하는 면이 있겠지만 점차 북한 시스템이 변하면서 자발적인 자율적인 그 발전을 이룰 수 있는 그런 토대가 그 마련되리라고 봅니다. 그리고 앞으로 그 북한 경제에서 중국만이 한다고는 저는 안 봅니다. 지금 그 당분간은 남북 간이라든가 미국이라든가 일본 관계가 지금 꽉 막혔지만 조만간에 아주 빠른 시일에 저는 남북 관계도 트이고 역시 그 미국이나 일본과 관계도 점차 트이리라고 봅니다. 그러면 중국이 지금 그 북한하고 경제 교류를 하는 것은 역시 선도적으로 북한을 먼저 좀 개변시키고 변화시키는 쪽으로 나가는 게 아닌가 그래서 긍정적으로 보려고 합니다. 왜 그런가 하면 한국에서 그 북한하고 직접 하게 되면 북한은 좀 체제 그 유지에서 그 굉장히 그 위험 부담을 많이 느끼고 하는데 중국과 하는 데서는 좀 그런 게 더 적지 않는가요? 그래서 중국이 이 북한하고 지금 하는 이거는 앞으로 한국이나 미국이나 일본이 북한하고 경제 교류를 하기 위해서 기초를 마련하는 걸로 보고 쪽이 더 적극적인 거 아닌가 생각합니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one question on the economics that I suspect either Professor Joe, Professor Jin, or Professor Delury may want to buy into. But one of the things that no one talked about was the monetary reform, which took place really in, as I read it, an effort to pull the profits of traders who were benefiting from the market and essentially a state confiscation of monies made in the market. And I guess the general question that I would ask is whether those in the North who follow market principles and who make money will have to worry about the possibility of a future confiscation that comes down the road, and whether this will be a major impediment to the deepening of market reforms. Let me ask John if you have any thoughts on this. I realize that wasn't quite your primary focus, but you were talking about the shift between markets and a planned economy and markets. I don't know if you have thoughts on the monetary arrangements, and then I'll ask Professor Joe and Professor Jin.
Sure. Just quickly, that is definitely one of the most recent and important signs of, again, this gray zone that the regime is in, where they're not comfortable with harnessing the grassroots marketization that are bottom up that John talked about. So that will be the business environment has that unknown. So it's absolutely, that's one of the basic. There are others. I mean, the entire currency system has to be cleaned up, and there's massive amounts of sovereign debt that have to be dealt with. So to normalize North Korea in economic terms, so that people can do business and make money there, and plan for the future and have some modicum of security in their business dealings. That's going to take these kind of fundamental changes. The only thing I'd add, though, is that that I'm not sure. First of all, I think we still have limited empirical understanding of exactly how it all played out in terms of the currency redenomination. And I sort of had the sense in the visit that I made later that next year that because it was followed up by some attempts to curtail markets, that those were more or less seen as a failure. So the state, insofar as that was an attempt by the state to reassert its control, it didn't work. So the state, I think, learned something from the process. But absolutely, that's the kind of thing that has to change if you're going to see, a fundamental economic reform.
Professor Jin, any thoughts on the monetary question down the road, in the future?
저는 북한의 그 화폐 개혁이 그 주요 원인이 사실은 북한이 그때 화폐 개혁을 실시할 때 경제가 최근 년간에서 그때 제일 좋았을 때입니다. 지금보다는 뭐 그렇지만 화폐 개혁 실시할 때는 그 밑에 전보다는 경제가 굉장히 좋았을 때입니다. 좋았을 때 왜서 화폐 개혁을 했냐 하게 되면 저는 사실은 이 시장 경제 요소를 싹 자르고 계획 경제 통제 이쪽으로 더 가려고 한 게 주요 원인이라고 봅니다. 근데 그게 실패를 했거든요. 그러니까 실패를 했다는 그 자체는 사실 시장 경제의 힘을 화폐 계약 실패로부터 북한에서 터득했지 않나 생각합니다. 그래서 화폐 계약은 뭐 실패했지만 거기서 그 얻은 교훈은 굉장히 북한에 있어서 긍정적이라고 저는 봅니다.
Yeah, let me just add one more. I don't think the motive, the basic motive for currency reform about 1.5 years ago in North Korea is not economic, it's political. What I mean is that people who make money most in the market are traders, trading companies, and in North Korea, every trading company has to get approved by the North Korean government, and most big trading companies are owned by military. So, in other words, military people are getting bigger and bigger. So, North Korea is in the process of power transition. So in order to make Kim Jong-un get power, North Korean Kim Jong-il or North Korean government has an incentive to, squeeze those new big military groups. That is, I think, one of the major reasons for currency reform.
Thanks. Let me shift finally to the third big area, and that is, what does the rest of the world do? And John Delury made the, I think, valuable point that if one draws the example from China, countries like China, like North Korea, are going to be focused most on security, and once security is in place, then they might be prepared to think about development and reform. But the question that I want to pose to him is whether he envisions North Korea being in a situation analogous to that of China in 1970 or 71 or 72. Clearly, the Nixon visits to China and the guarantees of security to China by the United States were very much part of a large geopolitical game. And I guess the question is whether you see North Korea as being in a same kind of pivotal position to take advantage of that so as to somehow get security guarantees from the immediate neighbors, most particularly the United States, and if so, whether that security guarantee will have to come even with the North holding nuclear weapons.
Yeah, well, you've put your finger on it, TJ. I mean, I think that's the critical. I think there are different ways in which it could happen. I mean, this is the contrast with the Chinese case, is that for reasons that went strongly against ideology, and of course Nixon took serious political risks in what he did because of the geopolitics, because of the common threat of the Soviet Union. It made sense in the mind of Henry Kissinger, who was able to convince Nixon to do what they did with China. And the closest thing, I mean, North Korea can't compare with that. The closest thing is, the Soviet Union here is North Korea's own nuclear program. And so that's but I think Kim Jong-il is willing to be Mao, but no American president has wanted to be Nixon. And so far, President Obama is not showing interest in being Nixon either. I do think it's possible. I mean, I think there are different ways in which North Korea could achieve this sense of security that I'm saying is a prerequisite for reform and opening. One would be through exactly that scenario where if the United States in particular gets to the point where they think North Korea would actually follow through with the plan as outlined in the six-party talks, that would be, from an American perspective, the optimal outcome, the optimal way this could happen, but with a lot of political capital being put up on all sides. Another, one of the least optimal from an American perspective, would be that North Korea keeps its nuclear capacity and eventually, if things go on, they become convinced they have a nuclear deterrent and they'll never be Libya and they'll never be Iraq, and somehow in a longer time span. That gives them some modicum of security. And then, the third would be that China provides the role vis-a-vis North Korea that the United States essentially provides to South Korea. And you have some kind of extended deterrence on both sides that then gives North Korea that. But, North Korea, I think, is unlikely to want to play that role. I think they'd rather have option 2 or 1.
Thanks. A very different perspective on how and where we go was provided by Professor Okonogi in his written comments about talking points. He didn't have the chance to speak about it here, but certainly one of the possibilities for in a combination of economic reform and engagement of the North would come if and when Japan normalizes relations with the DPRK. And Professor Okonogi points out in his remarks that basically Japan would be in a position to provide substantial assistance to the North, major financial and infrastructural building. And my question to him would be whether he still thinks this is feasible given the 3/11 disasters in Japan and given the probability that the Japanese government will now have to focus very heavily on providing resources for the areas that have been so severely affected by the triple disaster.
일본의 지진이 국제관계 여러 가지로 영향을 많이 미치고 있습니다만 가장 큰 영향을 미친 분야가 일본의 대북한 전쟁이 아닌가 그런 느낌도 있습니다. 왜 그렇게 생각하는가? 납치 문제 때문에 일북한 관계는 벌써 오래전부터 나빠졌습니다만 그래도 문제를 해결해서 관계를 정상화해야 한다. 그렇게 주장하는 사람들 있었습니다. 북한과의 관계를 생각할 때 보통 일본 사람들이 납치 문제, 핵 문제, 그리고 국교 정상화 문제 세 가지가 머릿속에 있는데 그런데 지금 지진의 영향이 너무 커서 납치 문제에 대한 동정심이 안 가요. 예를 들면은 역전해서 모기무해도 다들 지진에 대한 위험금을 합니까? 도네이션을 하죠. 납치 문제에 정부도 관심을 모이기가 어렵습니다. 핵 문제도 마찬가지입니다. 북한 핵 문제도 문제이지만 일본 핵 문제가 또 큰 문제입니다. 원자로 발전소가 몇 개 있는데 50개나 있는데 그거 어떻게 하는가? 머리 그쪽으로 가 있습니다. 그리고 펜프레스 교수가 하신 대로 그러면 국교 정상화하면 또 100억 불이나 돈이 필요하겠지 않느냐? 그럼 돈 문제도 있습니다. 그래서 조건이 나빠질 수밖에 없다고 그렇게 볼 수가 있습니다. 그러나 그래도 만일 북한이 주변 나라하고 관계를 개선하고 핵에 대해서 포기는 안 하되 어느 정도의 그것을 동결을 해서 국제적인 합의, 감식 그런 게 달성되고 그리고 나서 국교 정상화 생각한다면은 그야 정상화 할 때는 하여튼 써야 하는 돈은 써야 한다. 그건 다름이 없다고 나는 생각합니다. 일본의 돈이란 게 내가 쓴 페이퍼 속에 그렇게 지적했는데 다른 나라한테 북한에 지원하는 돈하고 다릅니다. 왜냐하면 식민지 시대에 배상랑 측면이 있기 때문에 그것은 그란트로 되는 거, 주로 그란트로 되는 거, 혹은 아주 뭐랄까 장기적으로 착안으로 되는 돈이기 때문에 코마셜 베이스 아닙니다. 그래서 좋을 때 좋은 기회에 그것을 이용하면은 다른 경제 활성화에 이용할 수 있는 큰 틀이 생긴다. 그렇게 지금도 생각하고 있습니다.
I've probably abused the role of chair, and we only have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to open up the possibility for questions from the floor. I will ask that you be extremely brief, and if you have your questions targeted to a particular individual, that you identify to whom your question is directed. Anybody who would like to raise something? A gentleman back here.
Hello, good morning. Good afternoon, rather. I just a question regarding the connection between the state of the economy and succession. When, I mean, there's increasing transfer of information and goods between China and North Korea. Do you think that increasing the level of living, of livelihood, has become a key concern for the North Korean regime in order to have a successful succession? Do they believe that they need to increase the economic condition to make sure that the regime is successful in its third generation? Because a lot of people now they can compare the situation in China and in Pyongyang or in other provinces. So I'm wondering whether this is a concern for the regime. So maybe Professor Jo Dong-go, maybe.
Well, I believe Kim Jong-il, the great leader of DPRK, is not evil. He is anyway leader of a country, and North Korea is a country anyway. So the country or the government has to care about their people. So, as we all know, next year North Korea has to declare that they achieve strong and prosperous country. That means North Korean government has on every incentive to increase people's living standard. Otherwise, people don't believe the government. So, on one hand, North Korean government has an incentive to improve the quality of lives of their people, but on the other hand, the DPRK also needs some material capacities to normalize offshore and private sector. That is what I see.
John? Did you?
Just a quick point on this, because I think there's a tendency to link so many things to succession. It's understandable, but one way analytically is just, if you take out succession, could this still be happening plausibly? And I think even in the case of the emphasis on livelihood, that language at least predates Kim Jong-il's health problems, which is usually considered the trigger of speeding up the succession process. So I would just echo that point, that it's already been part of the North Korean regime. It's the language and its defense of itself, and it's increased in its prominence even prior to all the issues with Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un.
Sam, and then I'm going to have to call it quits.
Let me rephrase the question I asked this morning. Would all of you be willing to reopen the Six-Nation Party, Six-Nation talks, accepting the fact that North Korea is a nuclear state? And if so, are you prepared to accept Japan nuclearization as a result of that opening?
I'll be an arbitrary chairman and ask for yes or no answers from everyone. You get two answers, one concerning whether we have to accept the North Korean nuclear material, and then whether you would accept Japan as a nuclear power in response. Professor Okonogi?
육자, yes. 인정, no. Well, I think. Okay.
Yes, but I don't want to know from Japan.
Huh?
Professor Joe?
We need a six-party talk to solve North Korea's nuclear program. However, if we really want to solve North Korean nuclear issues, we need much more sincere effort at the six-party talk. Don't just say, stop the program, but we need something to give. Sorry.
No, but let me add, because the six-party talks wouldn't make sense. But I'll be controversial and echo Yen Shui-tong that if the relationships changed, I think the parties should be able to consider living with a nuclear North Korea, but not as far as the six-party talks is concerned. And that should not be the starting point of negotiation, but it should be in the back of people's head.
No to ensure no. And I suppose the qualification to that is, it depends what you mean by a nuclear North Korea. De facto, I think, we already have a nuclear North Korea, and therefore we need talks. But it can't be acknowledged, otherwise we have a yes to the second question, which is clearly undesirable.
Finally, Professor Jin.
예, 저도 똑같은 생각입니다. 북핵 문제는 그렇게 하면 안 된다고 보는데, 근데 한마디만 얘기를 하면 북핵 문제는 사실상 동북아 국제정치의 집약된 산물이라고 봅니다. 그래서 육자회담은 북핵 문제를 해결하는 동시에 동북아의 산적한 문제를 해결하는 제 최적의 시스템으로 생각합니다.
I'm afraid we're out of time, so I'm going to have to declare the session officially over. I want to thank people for their patience. I know that many of you may have questions, and some of the panelists may be prepared to answer these independently, but I have a plane to catch, so I'm definitely not going to stick around. But thank you again very much, and please join me in thanking the panelists for a very interesting session.